In today's video, I'm excited to take you through every step of this unique project. It's a combination lock merged with a knife. This design has been over a year in the making and it's definitely been a challenging one. The knife style is a barrel knife, a type of pocket knife that stores the blade in the handle but in an unusual way. I thought it'd be interesting to take it a step further by turning the handle into a working lock. The tricky part is fitting the functional blade into the lock while keeping everything proportional and maintaining the right size for a comfortable handle. Anyway, on paper it looks like it may work, and to make it I've got some help from a couple of awesome mates. You may remember Sean from when I went to his workshop a couple of years ago to make a folding knife, and if you've seen my other videos you'll already know who Corin is. We've only got 4 days together, so we'll get straight into it. Corin is going to start on the core of the knife, which will be made from brass. It'll hold the dials of the combination lock and the ferrules at either end. While Corin is making that, Sean will start on the blade from a piece of Damascus that he and Corin made together a few years ago. Sean doesn't like us to mention that he's a master smith, but he is, and his work is incredible. I'm certainly very lucky to be working alongside him on this project. And I should also mention that Corin has made many barrel knives and he's a bit of an expert on them, so also very lucky to have him here too. Also, it's just great to hang out with two of my very good friends. Sean is just grinding the steel into a rough blank first, and then he'll refine it further on the surface grinder later on. We've started off at a super fast pace. I'm trying to keep up with them with the camera and trying to capture all the action. But don't worry though, I do play a big part in making the knife too. We thoroughly went over the design together and worked out a plan of attack. We reckon it should work as intended, but I think we all agree that this is probably the most challenging thing any of us have ever made. Corin is turning down the ends of the core, which the ferrules will get fixed onto. The wider part in the centre will be what the dials will rotate around. He's using a parting tool now to set the length of the centre section, then he'll turn it around in the chuck and turn down the opposite end. That's the first part done, well done for now, but we'll need to do more later on, and Sean is surface grinding the blade. The blade blank needs to be accurate, just like all of the parts in this project. That's why we're taking the time to get the blank parallel and down to the correct thickness. When I bought the surface grinder, I really wasn't too sure what I'd use it for, but lately I find I'm using it all the time.
Well, now it's not rocking.
The camera's on the tripod and I'm getting involved milling the slot in the core. That's where the blade will get stored in the closed position or it will pass through in the open position, but that's only if you know the combination to the lock. I'm probably getting ahead of myself there. I'm sounding confident, which really isn't the case. We're using a 4mm end mill and it doesn't have enough reach to get to the depth that we need, so we'll modify it on the belt grinder by removing some of the material off the shoulder. The slot goes all the way through on the ends, but leaves a small amount on the wider section in the centre.
Right, so Neil, I reckon what I'm going to do, instead of drilling straight into the Damascus in one go, because we've only got one shot at that, I think I'm actually going to use the template, and I will use that to make the, I guess we're calling it, what do we call it, the sleeve?
Yep.
Make that functional against the template. Which I can actually use this for sizes and everything, and we can use this in the open position to make sure that our stop pinhole is exactly where we want it.
Yep.
I'll just cut 2 pieces of brass, super glue them together, grind them the same. We'll leave these features for last, but if I can get this functional and working, then I can use this as a drill template for the Damascus, and we know we're right.
And then make the blade.
And then make the blade.
Cool. The blade will get housed within a sleeve, which is what the brass is for. So as Sean just mentioned, that's what he's working on next. There's two identical sides to the sleeve. That's the reason why we're gluing them together. So when we shape it, both sides will be exactly the same. We'll heat them up to release them when the sides are done. Of course, we're using Bondi Bond for all our CA glue tasks. If you're interested in getting hold of some, I'll put a link in the description. It's an awesome product and you'll be supporting me and my channel at the same time. This is the first time that my recently made optical centre punch has been used in an actual project, and it worked great.
Right, yeah, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to use, instead of trying to drill this hole, I'm actually going to use the template of the blade itself and use it as a drill template to make sure the hole's in exactly the right spot. So if I put that in exactly the aligned up position that I want and drill through it, the hole's got to be in the right spot. Yep, that's pretty good.
Some of these parts weren't made in the exact order I'm showing them in, but pretty close though. You can hear Corin running the lathe in the background, making a separate part.
Get in there and clean it up with a file.
It really was pretty chaotic, even if it doesn't look like it, and definitely not as relaxed as how I usually work. While Sean carries on with the brass sleeve, Corin is turning the ferrules, which we're making from steel. My scrapwood challenges have accumulated millions of views on YouTube, and now if you click the link in the description below, you can take the opportunity to join not only me but also my good friend Jimmy DeResta as we host the project Salvaging Scraps, a two-part live series where we walk you through the process of turning low cost or even free scrap wood into a stunning piece of sellable furniture. So if you're a hobbyist or just someone who's looking to make a little bit of extra money with woodworking, then click the link in the description below, join the waitlist, and Jimmy and I will notify you the second we go live, and we look forward to seeing you there. That's one done, and we did the other off camera. The ferrules will get attached to the core using these tiny torque screws. The front one will have 2 screws and the back will have 4. Next we'll mill out a slot for the blade and the sleeve to pass through. The ends of the slot need to be square, so we'll attempt to broach them using this high-speed steel tool that we just ground. It's a bit skinny and may deflect a bit, but there's not much room for a bigger broach, so we'll see how it goes, and we can always finish it with a file. I tried broaching for the first time recently, and I was surprised how well it works. You just need to lock the quill so it can't rotate, and then take the slightest cut each time. It takes a while, but it really does work very well. That's one end of the slot done. We'll turn it around and do the other end, and we're using a stop so we can butt it up to that and we'll know that it's in the correct position. That's the front ferrule done, and the back one went just as well. Back to the brass sleeve, and we'll see how Sean's getting on. It looks like it's functioning well, so next we'll make a piece that sits above the blade and gets sandwiched between the two sides of the sleeve. This will get soldered to the sides, but to keep it all together and in position, we'll drill and pin all the pieces together first. We'll put the sleeve aside for now and get back to the blade. Using the template, we'll drill out the pivot hole and also the hole for the stock pin. The pivot hole will be drilled out larger as we'll make a brass bushing rather than the pin pivoting directly on the blade.
So 3/16, we need a 4.7 millimeter. You got one?
Yeah.
Excellent.
That's the blade profile shape, so next we'll heat treat it, and we've decided to do this with induction forge. We're confident that we can get a good result, but as the knife is more of a concept piece, it's not super critical, but we do still want it to be a good blade.
So not touching it, yeah?
Not touching. Well, if the 50 touched and the 65 didn't, then it'd be a worry.
And so that's the 65, yeah?
That's the 65. Not
touching it.
Just skipping.
So maximum.
Maximum.
That turned out perfect, somewhere between 60 and 65 Rockwell. So next we'll put it in the oven to temper and add some strength back to the blade. Now we'll continue with the core of the knife. We made a dummy piece to keep the ferrules aligned while we drill through those and into the core. The screws are super tiny, and if I remember correctly, the ones on the back are M1.6 and the ones on the front ferrules are M2s. Now we need to drill the holes in the ferrules slightly larger for the screws to pass through, and then we'll also countersink them. The blade has had a couple of hours tempering in the oven, so it's ready to come out.
I can immediately tell we've got a bit of a slight bulge because we're touching here and we're touching here. And then when you flip it over on the other side, we're actually cleaning it up in the middle, which means obviously it's going to be rocking like this. So we'll straighten that out with a carbide hammer first before we put it on the surface grinder, because if you put it on the surface grinder like this, the magnet's going to pull it down. You're going to grind, you're going to release the magnet, you're going to end up having a cup in it. Good.
Next we'll drill the pivot hole out again. We'll use a carbide drill as it may have distorted with the heat treating, and to get it super accurate we'll finish it with a barrel lap. These tools are Sean's that he brought with him, and I probably would have just skipped this step, but next time I make a folding blade I'll probably get a hold of some. Sean made a brass bush off camera, so now we can fit it together, we can mark around the template and get the final profile.
How to take that.
Now that the blade is shaped, we can start fitting it all together. We're heating them up so we can release the glue, and then we can put all the pieces together with pins. I've had this torch for a little while, but I haven't had a chance to try it out. It's an LPG and compressed air torch, which I got from Gamaco Artisan Supplies. It's super convenient as it has a nice control flame and gets very hot. It's ideal for soldering, which is what we're going to do now, joining the sleeve together.
Anyway, all good.
Yeah. The sleeve's looking good, so we can put that aside for now and start the interesting stuff, which is the parts for the lock mechanism. The dials will be the main parts, but in between each of those will be a spacer, and we're going to start making those first. The spacers need to be kept in position on the core and not allowed to be rotated. They'll need a key to prevent that from happening, and because of this extra step, that's why we decided to make them before the dials. They will need parting off into separate rings, but we'll broach a keyway into the tube first, and then we'll split them up into 6 rings.
So now I need to touch off on both sides.
We need 2 keyways on the spacers, one for the key that I mentioned to prevent it from rotating, and another at 90 degrees from it, which will be at the top, and that's to allow the sleeve and blade to pass through it. Again, we've set a stop so we can just turn the collet 90 degrees and broach the next keyway. There is some deflection, but the keyway's defined, and we can file each one to fit after they've been separated into rings. Before we part them off, we'll turn a shoulder onto the end, and this will fit into a recess that we'll make in the dials. All of these pieces will make more sense as we get further into it and start fitting them together. That's the first one done. Corin kept going and making the rest while me and Sean cleaned them up with files.
Alright Neil, what's the dimensions for number 6?
There's one last one which is thinner than the rest, as it doesn't have a shoulder to fit into a dial. That's the first parts of the lock machine, so next we'll solder in the keys.
Pretty fiddly.
Yeah.
Test the joint too.
Can't do much better than that, Sean.
That's all of them done. There is more to do on them later, but next we'll cut a slot along one side of the core for the key in the spacer to fit into. Now we're filing each spacer to fit nicely onto the core.
Soldered? Is that 1mm plate or is that one?
No, I'll make that
Well, and
You can't get to it after the plate's on.
They went very well, so next we'll start on the dials. As I mentioned earlier, the dials need a recess for the spaces to fit into, so we'll cut those first and then part them off. The dials were easier than the spacers, so it didn't take too long at all. Now I'll put it all together and see how it looks. The dials turn and the spacers stay put, so looking good. We'll put it aside for now and get back to the blade where Sean is grinding the bevels. I'm glad that Sean's here doing this step. I'm sure I'd do an okay job, but nowhere near to this standard. Sean hand sanded the blade, which he makes look easy. It's something I always struggle with. I can get it looking good, but to get it looking super clean isn't easy. We're back on the dials and broaching them. This will be for the blade to pass through, and this time we've decided to do each one separately. The spacers worked out well with some filing, but we should have maybe done those individually as well. This whole project is prototyping and experimental. As I've already mentioned, we don't know if it's actually going to work, and even if it does, how well it will work. We're all right into the project though, and we're having an awesome time. The slot through the ferules and core need refining to allow the sleeve to fit. There's a lot of filing and test fitting to get it just right. With all the filing, the portion of the core holding the two sides together got very thin, but we realised that it wasn't needed, so we just discarded it. As I mentioned, there's a lot of check in progress as we go, working out what needs to come off where, remove that, and then check again and so on. It was a slow process, but at this stage it'd be easy to ruin things by going too far too quickly. You can't put material back on after it's been removed. We're getting somewhere with it, so we'll clean up the dials and the spacers and do a test fit. The sleeve fits through it while it's all together, so now we can move on to the next part, which is a cap on the back of the sleeve. It's basically just a disc with a spigot, and that will get a tether ring through it later on. We'll reverse it in the chuck, face it, and then drill and tap a mounting hole. We'll also drill and tap the end of the sleeve, and to join the cap on, we'll use a piece of tiny threaded rod made from a bolt. The cap will get soldered to the end of the sleeve, and the threaded rod is just there to hold it in place. Before we solder it together, we'll start making a hole for a spring to fit through, which we'll get to in a little while. The hole will need refining more, but now's a good time just to get it started. The spring will get attached to the sleeve and engage with the back of the ferrule. This is to keep the blade locked either in the open or closed position, and this will all make more sense later on. We're using low temperature solder so we don't affect this soldering that we've already done.
Okay, springy.
For the spring we're using a piece of Damascus, and because this needs filing, the job was given to me as that's my thing, and to keep things accurate I'm using a file guide. It'll get attached to the sleeve with 2 small screws, and as you can already see we've drilled those off camera. There needs to be a thin section in the middle, which will be the spring, and then it ramps up towards the back where there'll be a slot which engages with the back of the ferrule. There's no room for sloppiness here. Just because I'm using a file, the slot has to fit precisely into the back of the ferrule. I'm getting it close but making sure not to take too much off, and then we can refine it later. The end of the spring needs a grip, so to do that I'll use a checkering file.
I'll do that.
It's looking good, it just needs a bit of rounding over, and then it's ready to put a bend in and heat treat it.
I'm going to say things just to make sure.
Didn't have much time.
1,
Yeah, right.
2, 3. Got a cup.
Next we need a groove in the side of the brass core, and that's for clearance for the spring to sit in as the sleeve is pushed into the knife. There's one more thing to do. We need to file a space in the ferrule for the spring to pass through. The spring works great, and this was the stage that Sean and Corinne last saw the knife. Our 4 days together have come to an end, so it's down to me to finish it from here. There's still a fair bit to go, so I'll get straight back into it. At the moment, the sleeve fits the knife, but that stops the dials from turning. So the first thing I need to do is file gates into the top of the sleeve. I'll mark across the top to keep the position of the dials. It's a shame we didn't have another day or two, but hopefully I can finish it to a decent standard that the guys are happy with, and hopefully I get something functional. I'll mark one side of the gates directly off the dials, and then the other side I'll mark with calipers set at the correct distance. I'm just getting them all started, and then I'll work on each one until the corresponding dial can rotate around it. I'm testing the first dial and working out where I need to refine the gate, then file it some more and check again, and so on, and I'll do that for all of them. And by the way, from now on, I'll keep the order of all the spacers and dials the same. That's the first one rotating freely. Now to get the rest of them working the same. I've got them all working, but the edges of the gates need easing to get a smoother action. At the moment, they're catching here and there, but you can see it's becoming a lock. That's much better and it's working super smooth. The next problem is you have to carefully line up each dial, and that could become a real pain. The answer to that is to add ball detents. I did a practice on a spare dial that we made, although the detents actually need to be on the spacers. I'll do those on the milling machine with the hole pattern feature. I've got the collet block centered and zeroed, and to keep some sort of consistency between the spacers, I've put together this crude setup to locate into the key of each one so they'll all be positioned the same. If you're not familiar with how the hole pattern feature works, here's a quick run through. The drill is centered to the ring and zeroed, then I've added the diameter of the circle, next to the number of holes, which is actually 15, and then the start and finish angle. I then go to hole number 1, which gives me the coordinates that I need to move the table to, and I do that by moving both the X and Y until they get to 0. After drilling the hole, or a divot in this case, I move on to hole 2 and so on. And by the way, the reason I set it to 16 holes when I only need 15 is that it's actually easier to add a hole and adjust the start and the end angles. It seems backwards, but it does work, and it makes it easier to work out those angles. The hole pattern feature works well and it's very easy to use. You also get pretty quick at moving the table between positions. That's one done. Now for the rest of them. There'll be a tiny 1.6mm ball bearing between each spacer and dial, which will sit in one of the divots. On the opposite face of the next dial, there'll be a hole with a tiny spring which will push the ball into one of the 15 divots, and by doing so, select a letter on the dial. I've realised that if I drill a hole to match up with the divot, it's going to slightly show through on the side of the dial, but I've worked out if I re-drill all of those divots and move them towards the centre, I may just have enough room. It really is the tiniest amount, it's just 0.3mm, and I can't go any more than that, as the matching hole in the dial would break through to the inside of the dial. To mark the hole position on the dial, I'll use one of the ball bearings. It doesn't matter which divot it goes in, as long as the spacer and dials are lined up, which they are. You can't really see, but the sleeve is in the knife and nudged just high enough so one of the gates is keeping the dial in line with the spacer. I haven't changed my setup other than to put the correct size collet in. I still have the same 0, so I've moved over the same amount to match the diameter of the divot circle. I'm being extra careful to rotate the dial in the collet to seat the drill nicely in the mark that I just made. You can see here the limits I'm playing with, and as I mentioned, I couldn't have gone any closer to the centre as I'd be drilling through the inside of the dial. For the spring, I'll get them from a cheap pen. They're far too big, but the wire is very thin, so I'll straighten them out and make new springs. The wire is 1/4 millimetre, so using a 1mm drill bit to form them, I should have a 1.5mm wide spring. I really didn't have much hope here. I just crossed my fingers and got on with it. If these don't work, I don't know what I'll do next, but I'll have to think of something. It may not look the best, but it actually worked out very well. I've put it together to try out the first dial and it works great, so now I'll do the others. Now to carefully put it all together and hopefully without all the bits flying around all over the place. That works fantastic, just like it should, so now I'll strip it back down and I'll start adding some style and shape to the ferrules. I've made a mandrel to hold them on the lathe while I taper them. I'm a bit worried about this step, so I'm just checking that nothing really bad is about to happen, like cutting through to the inside. Even though it's subtle, you can see that it already looks better than the other one, so I'll do that one next. The handle and ferrules on original barrel knives would be oval. We can't make the centre of this handle oval though, for obvious reasons. I'm thinking about transitioning from round to oval on the ferrules though, but I'm not sure about that, and Sean and Corinne reckon I should just leave it as it is. I'll put it back together again to see how it looks. The cap needs reducing in size to match the back of the ferrule. I'll move the sleeve back one gauge, lock it in position, then I can hold the whole knife in the collet chuck. I've decided to bite the bullet and try and oval the ferrules. As you look down the knife from the top, it'll look more streamlined. Not that it looks too bad, but I'll just be happier as long as I don't ruin it. I'll start by milling a flat on each side. That went well, so I'll do the other one. Now I'll start rounding out the shape. I'll use Sharpie as it should give me a bit of a guide of where I'm going. I haven't mentioned my little vise yet that I recently made, but it's been awesome. This is the kind of project I made to use it on. I just need to find a better way of securing it to the workbench. At the moment, I only have one bolt holding it down. I wasn't feeling confident about how this was going. I thought I'd ruined it at one point, but kept going, and I made some minor tweaks which actually made a huge difference, and it all came together. I'll put the handle aside for now and finish the blade. I'll mix up some ferric chloride and etch the Damascus to bring out the pattern. To avoid the holes in the blade getting etched and possibly changing size, I'll paint some nail varnish in them first. I've thoroughly cleaned both the blade and the springs so they're ready to etch. After a minute, I checked them to see if there were any streaks. They looked good though, so they went back in for a few minutes more. I then rinsed them, cleaned the surface with fine wire wool and put them back in the solution for another 2 or 3 minutes. I did that cycle 6 times, then neutralised them with a bicarb solution. Next I'll do a coffee etch which will darken the dark parts of the pattern, but it won't affect the brighter areas. This will give more contrast and punch. I have made Damascus once before with my mate Matt, but I've never gotten around to using it, so this is the first time that I've actually etched any. I left it in the fridge overnight and I'm really not sure why, but I'm just following instructions. I'll clean it up, remove the nail varnish and then put some oil on it to prevent it from rusting. I reckon the blade looks amazing, but Sean isn't happy with it. In all of the chaos early on, moving backwards and forwards between parts, somehow more was taken off one side of the blade blank than the other, which has resulted in a different pattern either side of the blade. It still looks amazing to me, but Sean's going to make a new blade for it later on. There's one last thing to make, and that's a tethering to go through the spigot at the end. I'll make that from some K&S brass rod. I'll put the tiniest piece of flattened solder between the gap. I still need to sand and polish all of the parts, but that doesn't look too bad. Here's all the pieces laid out, so the first thing I'll finish are the ferules, which I'll nickel plate. I just need to final sand them to a high grit and also sand the screw heads flush. I went through the grits up to 2500, and the better the preparation for nickel plating, the better the finish. I'll keep all of the screws in the correct order so they go back in the same place to keep them flush. I've already cleaned them with acetone and I'm thoroughly washing and rinsing them here before I nickel plate them. They go in the solution for 15 minutes. All I need to do is keep the temperature between 88 and 92 degrees C. They look great, so now I'll clean the other parts and then I need to etch some designs onto the sleeve and also the lettering onto the dials. I need to give a big thanks to Hoation for sending me this fibre laser. It's the perfect tool for etching this project. In the past I've used the vinyl cutter to make a resist for chemical etching my designs, but that method just wouldn't get a fine enough resolution needed here. So this is going to be awesome, and it's also going to be super handy for future projects. The first design I'll etch is on the sleeve, which is similar to a design from an original barrel knife from the 1800s. I'm making a few etching passes, then one to clean up the lines with a bright finish and one more pass to the arrow and date to blacken them. I reckon using the laser to try and replicate vintage items is an awesome use, and it really finishes off the project nicely. Other than a couple of tests, that's my very first laser etch and it looks amazing. Now for the other side, and again a big thanks to Hoation. And look how crisp those tiny letters look. They look amazing. It already looks like an original piece, and when it develops a patina, it really will look the part. Next I need to laser the dials, but first I'll spin them back on the lathe and give them a quick sand. We've made a mandrel to hold the dials while we laser them, and I have a plan on how to tackle this. I'm very nervous about it and don't want to ruin such a critical part, so I've tested some settings and worked out how to laser through Sharpie to see the design without affecting the brass underneath. I'm using the rotary attachment, which is a bit more involved, especially for somebody who hasn't lasered before, and that's why I'm a bit nervous about it. But if it looks good with this method, I can change the settings needed to etch it and just go for it. It looks good, so let's do it. As I said earlier, there's no way I could get lettering this fine with a vinyl resist and chemically etching, so this really has to be the way. That's looking great, so I'll mount it in the lathe and sand off the Sharpie. I just need to blacken the spaces for a contrast between them and the dials, and I'll do that with gum glue. There's one last thing to do before putting it all together, and that's laser a line across the spaces to indicate where to set the code. Corin wasn't impressed with the selection of small drivers that I have, so since he left, he made me a screwdriver with 55 small bits, with every bit that I'll ever need, things that I've never even seen before. I'll put a link to his website so you can check out his awesome tools. I don't think he has these ones on there yet, but email him and ask him about them if you're interested. The screwdriver is so much better. I really could have done with it earlier, especially with the amount of times that I've assembled this knife. I reckon it looks great, but I have made a mistake. I drilled the hole for the ring the wrong way, and it's difficult now to press the spring in. The ring should have gone through from top to bottom instead of sideways. Anyway, I quickly made a new one, which was Corin's idea, and this will give me the clearance needed to push the spring in. I reckon that looks much better anyway, and now I can push that spring in. I'll fit the blade and then we're all done and I can do a demo. I'll fit the stop pin first, and this is just a friction fit. The pin should be left a little bit long and then pinned over, but because Sean is going to remake the blade, I've kept it shorter just for a temporary fix. I'll add a drop of Bondi Bond just to stop the pin from falling out. that's it. It's all done, so let's give it a go. One thing I haven't done, and I'm not going to worry about it, is sharpen the blade, as Sean's going to make that new blade anyway. It'd be interesting to hear what you would have used for the code, but for me, I think that's perfect. And if you move the knife around a little bit, then you can see a second code. And if you turn it again, there's another. A huge thanks to Corin and Sean. What a fantastic project and some awesome memories made. I hope that you're both happy with it, and I hope that you all like it too. I can't wait for the next collaboration, as these are my absolute favorite projects. It's already developing a nice patina on the brass, but I think the nickel plating could do with another layer, but I'll see about that. A big thanks again to Hoation. The laser is an awesome addition to the workshop and will be a big help on future projects. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.